Hello, 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 and welcome back to Grace in the InBetween. I'm Lindsay, and I'm so glad you're here today. Last week, we spoke about letting go, about open hands, about surrender, about releasing the things we've been carrying for far too long, and trusting God enough to place them in His hands. And as I was reflecting on that episode afterwards, I found myself thinking about something. We spend a lot of time talking about surrender. We talk about releasing the relationship, the disappointment, the fear, the dream that didn't unfold the way we hoped it would. But we don't often talk about what comes next. What happens after we've let go? What happens after we finally place something in God's hands? Because if you've ever had to release something significant, you'll know that life doesn't suddenly look different the next morning. The responsibilities are still there, the unanswered questions are still there, and sometimes you're left wondering whether anything changed at all. Which brings me to a story I've never really told properly before. I mean, I've told pieces of it in conversations over the years, and little parts of it have slipped into a few episodes here and there, but I've never shared the whole story. A few years ago, I took a trip that changed my life. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, oh my gosh, this is another story about finding yourself while you're traveling, blah, blah. I know I would probably be rolling my eyes too, but hear me out. This wasn't that. Well, not in the way people talk about it. Because when I boarded that plane, I wasn't looking for a new life. I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't trying to escape anything. Honestly, I was just excited. My children were finally old enough for me to travel on my own. And it was almost my 40th birthday. And for the first time in my life, I was doing something purely because I wanted to. It wasn't for work, it wasn't a family trip, it was just for me. And if you know me at all, I am quite an awkward, weird person. So if I go places, I always like to have a buffer, and bless them, my kids were that for me for many years. I couldn't even go into groceries on my own. I had to take one or all of them with me. But here I was voluntarily flying across the world by myself, which shocked quite a few people. It shocked me as well, if I'm being honest. But what I didn't know at that time was that God was about to meet me in a way I never expected. Not through a sermon, not through a conference, not through some dramatic lightning bolt moment, but through a journey. And looking back now, I can see that what happened on that trip was the answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking. Because sometimes after we let go, God doesn't immediately change our circumstances. Sometimes He meets us first. The first stop of my trip was Bali. And Bali was everything I'd hoped it to be. It was beautiful, it was exciting, completely different from anything I had experienced before. I explored, I wandered, I tried new things, I got lost a few times, not spiritually, geographically. And I loved every minute of it. There was something wonderfully freeing about being completely responsible for my own day. If I wanted to change my plans, I could. If I wanted to spend an extra hour somewhere, I could. If I wanted to sit with a coffee and people watch the whole day, nobody was waiting for me, so I could. And it reminded me that life still held surprises, that there were still adventures ahead, that there were still dreams worth pursuing. And honestly, I thought that was the gift. There you go, Lindsay. Happy 40th. I thought Bali was the reason for the trip. But looking back now, I realized Bali was only the beginning. Because after Bali came Scotland. And while Bali gave me adventure, Scotland would give me something entirely unexpected. Not because I was looking for an encounter with God, because I honestly wasn't. I thought I was simply fulfilling a childhood dream. But God, as He so often does, had plans of His own. Now, to understand why Scotland mattered so much, I need to tell you something about myself, about Lindsay. I grew up by the ocean, and I don't know if anyone else who grew up near the sea will understand this, but I think it does something to your imagination. I know it did to mine. As a child, I spent hours on the beach. We all did. Collecting shells, exploring rock pools. I remember there were these big rocks, and we would each claim a rock, and that would be our own little castle, our own house. We would be walking along the shoreline, and I'd be making up stories in my head. I was forever imagining faraway places and grand adventures. In fact, I'm certain there was a stage where I genuinely believed I was a mermaid. Not wanted to be a mermaid. I actually believed I might be one. I was just very imaginative. And alongside my love for the ocean, I became completely fascinated by history, especially castles. There was just something about them. The stone walls, the stories, the battles, the mystery. The fact that people had lived entire lives within those walls hundreds of years before I was born. I read books about them. Actually, I would sneak some of my mom's books. She's an avid reader and she was into historical romance, and that's still one of my favorite genres up to this day. I would watch movies about them. I daydreamed about them. And somewhere along the way, Scotland became the place I associated with all of it. The castles, the history, the rugged landscapes, the sense of adventure. Scotland lived in my imagination long before it ever existed on my passport. It became one of those dreams that quietly follows you through life, the kind you don't talk about every day, but never quite let go of either. And isn't it funny how life works? You think you'll get to it one day, then 1 year becomes 5, 5 becomes 10, and before you know it, decades have passed. But somehow that dream, it never left me. And when I finally boarded that plane, I wasn't just traveling to another country. I was traveling towards something I had imagined for almost 30 years. I remember arriving and feeling the strange mixture of excitement and disbelief. Because have you ever wanted something for so long that when it finally happens, it almost doesn't feel real? And that's exactly how I felt. I kept looking around and thinking, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I'm actually here. It's not someday, it's not one day. I'm here now. After 30 years of dreaming about it, I was finally here. And what I didn't realize at the time was that God was about to use a childhood dream to lead me into one of the most significant encounters of my life. So when I landed in Scotland, I rented a car and I was driving. And I have to tell you, there is something incredibly humbling about realizing you're entirely responsible for getting yourself from one place to another in a country you've never visited before. For the first few minutes, I felt remarkably confident. I was like, ooh, ooh. And I put my playlist on. I was like, yes, this is my time. And that confidence lasted approximately 5 minutes. But thankfully, Scotland and I eventually reached an understanding. And so I drove. I drove through mountains, along lochs, past villages that looked as though they belonged inside a storybook. And I loved, oh my gosh, I loved every minute of it. I remember I kept on stopping after every like 30 minutes and just jumping out of the car and like standing and touching the grass and the trees. And I was, oh my gosh, I was absolutely in awe. I just could not believe it. There was something wonderfully freeing about knowing that I could stop whenever I wanted. I could take a detour if something caught my attention, which I did, and then I'd get lost. I could change my plans without consulting anyone. And for the first time in my life, there was nowhere I needed to be except where I already was. And so I began my mission to find as many castles as humanly possible. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you'll know this was not a minor detail. This was one of the reasons I had come. I had spent 30 years imagining these places, 30 years reading about them, watching films about them, building stories around them. And suddenly, I was standing in them. I was standing in these castles. I was touching the stone. I was walking through the ruins, looking out from towers, standing in bedrooms that held kings. I was reading about people who had lived there long before me, places that had stood for centuries. I thought of the battles they fought, the loves they lost, the choices they made, the lives they built. And I found myself so emotional because sometimes a dream sits in your heart for so long that you stop expecting it to happen. Not because you've given up on it, just because life gets busy. Years pass, other things take priority, and then one day you find yourself standing in the middle of something you once only imagined. I remember placing my hand against one of those ancient castle walls and thinking, my God, Lord, you remembered. Not because castles are important, but because they were important to me. And I think sometimes we forget that God cares about the things that matter to his children. Even the dreams we've carried quietly for decades, even the ones that seem small, even the ones nobody else knows about. What surprised me the most wasn't just the beauty of Scotland, and it was beautiful beyond anything I could have conjured up in my mind. It was the way being there slowed me down, the way I found myself paying attention again. I wasn't rushing, I was taking my time with everything. I found myself noticing things, listening more carefully, reflecting more deeply, as though Scotland wasn't simply a place I was visiting, as though it was preparing me for something. At the time, I thought I was just having the trip of a lifetime. But looking back now, I think God was gently preparing my heart for what was coming next. One afternoon, after a few hours of driving around and castle hunting, I stopped for lunch. And afterwards, I opened my phone and I started looking for somewhere to stay for the next few nights. And then I found it, this little cottage tucked into the side of a mountain. Honestly, it looked like something from a fairy tale. It had white walls and wooden beams and flowers growing outside. The sort of place every writer dreams of stumbling across. The sort of place where you immediately start imagining yourself spending hours with the notebook, staring thoughtfully out the window as though you have something so profound to say. Oh my goodness, it was beautiful. And the moment I arrived, I felt something settle inside me, just very quietly, as though I had arrived exactly where I was meant to be. The cottage had a small patio area overlooking a waterfall that flowed into a babbling brook. And I know this sounds ridiculous, but I became slightly obsessed with that brook. Every morning, I would sit outside with my coffee and breakfast and listen to the water. The waterfall cascading over the rocks, the brook winding its way through the landscape, the birds singing somewhere in the distance. It was so peaceful that it's actually difficult to explain. And not because life had suddenly just become perfect all of a sudden, but because there was no urgency. There was no rushing. I had no schedule. There was no noise. It was just the simple rhythm of creation carrying on exactly as God intended. And I think that's why I loved it so much, because so much of life feels hurried. We're always moving towards something, thinking about the next thing, planning the next thing, worrying about the next thing. But here, sitting beside that waterfall, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in a very long time. Nothing. And it was wonderful. I would sit there with my coffee long after breakfast was finished, just listening and watching and thinking, praying, just not asking God for anything, just enjoying being there. And looking back now, I think that little cottage was doing something I didn't fully understand at the time. It was slowing me down. And I wasn't because I was overwhelmed or exhausted, but because sometimes God has to slow our pace before He can capture our attention. And I think that is exactly what He was doing. I just didn't realize it. Because one morning, I would take a walk that I've never forgotten and I never will. After breakfast, I decided to walk down to the private beach. There was a path leading from the cottage through the trees, and I remember setting off with absolutely no expectations. I wasn't going looking for the Holy Spirit or planning some profound spiritual, extravaganza. I wasn't thinking, okay, today my life is going to change. No, I was simply going for a walk. Well, at least that's what I thought. The path wound through the trees, and with every step, the sound of the waterfall faded a little further behind me. The air felt different, fresh, still, quiet. And as I walked, I became increasingly aware of how little noise there was. No traffic, no notifications, no demands, no one needing anything from me, just the song of the birds, the wind moving through the trees, and the sound of my own footsteps. The further I walked, the quieter everything became. And then the trees opened, and suddenly it was all there. The sea, the mountains, the moor stretching out before me. And I just stopped. Not because I was trying to have a moment, but because the beauty of it caught me completely off guard. It was like the wind had been hit out of me. I just stood there looking out across the landscape and just trying to take it all in. The mountains seemed endless. The sky felt so big. And the sea stretched out in front of me. And for a moment, I felt so small. Not insignificant, small in the best possible way. The kind of smallness that reminds you the world is far bigger than your worries, far bigger than your plans, far bigger than the things you've been carrying. And as I stood there, I found myself thinking about the little girl who had dreamed about this place for most of her life. The little girl walking along a beach 1,000 miles away, imagining castles and adventures. The little girl who believed impossible things could happen. The little girl who filled notebooks with stories and spent hours building entire worlds in her imagination. And suddenly, it felt as though those two versions of me had met. The child who dreamed it and the woman who had finally arrived. I remember smiling to myself and thinking, I'm actually here. After 30 years of dreaming, I was standing in the middle of it, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Oh my gosh. Not because Scotland was everything I had imagined, it absolutely was and more, but because I could see God's fingerprints all over the journey. The timing, the opportunity, the freedom to be there, the years it had taken, the doors that had opened, the healing that had happened beforehand. I wasn't just looking at a landscape. I was looking at faithfulness. And as I stood there taking it all in, I noticed a wooden walkway stretching out across the moor. So I started walking slowly, taking in every detail, not knowing that before that walk was over, God was about to meet me in a way I would never, ever, ever forget. As I walked along that wooden pathway, something began happening that honestly I still struggle to fully explain. And not because it was dramatic, but because it was so personal. I became increasingly aware of God's presence. And I know that's one of those phrases that Christians use all the time, but I don't know how else to describe it. There was no worship music playing and no preacher speaking, no emotional church service. There was no one laying hands on me. It was just me, the sea, the mountains, the wind, and God. And as I walked, it felt as though all the noise that usually fills our lives had somehow fallen away. The plans, the distractions, the responsibilities, the constant movement, all of it was just gone. And for the first time in a very long time, I could hear my own heart. I reached the end of the walkway and stood looking out across the water, looking at all of this beauty of God's handiwork. And suddenly, things I hadn't thought about in years began surfacing. Old hurts, old disappointments, questions I thought I'd made peace with, dreams that hadn't unfolded the way I imagined, seasons that had left scars I rarely talked about anymore, things I had survived, things I had moved beyond, or at least convinced myself I had. Sitting there, I started talking to God. Honestly, not polished prayers and church prayers. It was just honesty. The kind that comes when there's nowhere left to hide. The kind that comes when you're standing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by God's creation, and suddenly realize He sees every part of your story. The beautiful parts, the painful parts, the parts you've healed from, and the parts you're still healing from. But here's the thing. This wasn't the first time I'd had that conversation with God. Not even close. I'd prayed before. I'd cried before. I'd surrendered before. I'd poured everything out before. Many, many times. In fact, I had become quite good at surrendering things to God. For about 24 hours, I'd lay it all down, feel wonderfully free, and then somewhere between the next morning and the following week, I'd quietly pick it all back up again. The worry, the responsibility, the grief, the fear, the need to understand, the need to control, the need to make sense of things that perhaps were never mine to make sense of. And I think many of us do that. We hand things to God. Then we spend the next month checking whether He's holding them correctly. Oh my goodness. But standing there that day, it was just different. I wasn't asking God to temporarily lighten the load. I wasn't asking him to hold it for a while so I could feel better. I wasn't planning to take it back. For the first time, I was ready to leave it with him completely. Not because it no longer mattered, it did. Not because it hadn't hurt, it had. Not because all my questions had been answered, they hadn't. But because standing there, looking back over my life, I suddenly realized something. God had never, ever left me. Not once. Not in the hardest season, not in the confusing season, not in the painful seasons, not in the seasons where I couldn't see what he was doing. He had carried me through every one of them. And if he had been faithful then, why was I still carrying things he had already asked me to give him? So I let go. I really let go. And I left it there. On that moor, under that vast Scottish sky. And I cannot fully explain what happened next. I only know that when I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. And not because anything had changed, but because for the first time, I wasn't carrying anything anymore. And the more I've reflected on that trip over the years, the more it reminds me of Moses. Not the Moses standing before Pharaoh, not the Moses parting the Red Sea, the Moses standing in front of a burning bush. Because when we read that story, we already know what comes next. We know God is about to use him in extraordinary ways. We know miracles are coming. We know deliverance is coming. But Moses doesn't know any of that yet. He's simply tending sheep, going about an ordinary day. And then God meets him. Not in a palace, not in a temple, not in front of a crowd, in the wilderness, alone. And what strikes me about that story is that God doesn't immediately change Moses' circumstances. The sheep are still there. The wilderness is still there. The challenges ahead, they're still there. But Moses is different. Because an encounter with God will do that. It doesn't always immediately change your circumstances, but it changes the way you walk back into them. And that's what happened to me in Scotland. I walked onto that moor carrying years of questions, fears, disappointments, and responsibilities. And I walked off it carrying something very different. Not a detailed plan for the future, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing God had met me there. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes his presence becomes the answer before the answer ever arrives. So, what happens after we let go? That was the question we started with today. And honestly, I think for many years, I assumed that letting go was the end of the story, the finish line. The moment everything would suddenly make sense. Harps would play and all the things. But looking back now, I can see it was really the beginning. Because what happened after I let go wasn't what I expected at all. God met me on a Scottish moor beside the sea in the middle of a childhood dream. And the beautiful thing is that He didn't meet me because I had my ducks all in a row. He didn't meet me because my faith was suddenly stronger. He didn't meet me because I had somehow earned the encounter. He met me because He is a Father who loves His children. And that's the lesson I've carried with me ever since. We spend so much of our lives asking God for answers, for directions, for clarity, for open doors, for breakthroughs, and there's nothing wrong with those prayers. But sometimes God offers us something even greater, His presence. Because answers solve immediate problems, but God's presence, it changes us. And once you've experienced that for yourself, you begin to understand that the greatest gift God gives us is not always the thing we asked for. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply knowing that He is with us. Looking back now, when I think about Scotland, I don't think about the castles first, although they were every bit as wonderful as I could have ever dreamed of. I don't think about the roads or the mountains or the cottage beside the waterfall. I think about God. I think about a Father who knew exactly where to find me, a Father who knew what my heart needed before I knew it myself, a Father who met me in a place I had dreamed of since childhood and reminded me that I was never carrying my story alone. And that's where I'll leave you today. Not with a challenge, not with a checklist, just a gentle invitation. Create some space this week. Take a walk, sit in the garden, watch a sunrise, listen to the ocean. Pay attention to the world God has created around you. Not because you're trying to force an encounter, because you can't. Not because you're trying to manufacture a moment. You can't do that either. But because sometimes God meets us when we finally stopped rushing. Sometimes He meets us when we've stopped demanding answers long enough to simply enjoy His presence. And if you find yourself in a season where it feels like nothing is changing, remember this: God is still working, even when you cannot see it, even when you cannot feel it, even when the circumstances remain exactly the same. Because sometimes the first thing He changes is you. And that changes everything. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Grace in the In-Between. And until next time, be kind to yourself. Stay close to God. And remember that His grace is often found right here in the in-between.